Right now, I'd like to welcome our second speaker, Mr. Peter Woodhead, who is an educational consultant here at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University, and he will be speaking on how much did COVID change ways of learning and communication in schools? Will there be a new normal in schools post-COVID? Peter, could you try sharing?
Thank you. Yes, first of all, check. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Good, good, great. Okay, I'm just going to try and share my screen then. Right. Can you all see that?
Yes, we can.
Good, good, good. Okay, right. I'll see if I can just get myself onto presenter mode here as well. Even better. Right. Is that good? Okay.
Yeah, looks good.
Good, good, good. Okay. Right. Well, first of all, thank you all, for inviting me to join your conference. If it wasn't for Jane, I wouldn't have known anything about the Talking Across the World events at all. But I've been really excited to be sitting in already and listening to these talks. Particularly Sal, I'm an educator. I've been in school. So much of what you said resonates with what I observed going on. So excellent work there. Well, here's me. To give you some idea of how long I've been in education, if you can recognize that strange yellow ruler at the bottom of the screen, then you're my generation. It's a slide rule for the younger members of the audience. Yes, I've been in education in the UK and Hong Kong now for about 50 years or so. So I'm making some reflections based on that experience about just what the impact of COVID was on schools during the last 2 years. And some of the sorts of indications of what may happen next. First of all, I just make an observation that whatever you call it, distance learning, learning at home isn't new. Some of you will recall that the UK set up the Open University in 1971, which is the year I started teaching, in fact. And of course, since the 50s in Australia, which is where I am now, there was learning at home through the radio. So the whole concept of not learning in a university or in a school or a college or whatever is not a new experience for us. Though of course there are differences. COVID, of course, was unexpected for us. It was sudden. It was a bit like that well-known asteroid that hit the planet Earth and destroyed the dinosaurs. And one of the questions we might consider is, did it destroy the digital dinosaurs as well? But it did arrive sort of like overnight. It was not a matter of choice at all. We had to do it. And that's an element I want to explore actually later on in this short presentation. And it was virtual. Now that's different from, your Open University and listening to the radio online. It's virtual. It was synchronous. It was in real time. Teachers had to actually find ways, as Sal has described, quite interestingly, of how do you engage students in a virtual learning environment. And they are there because they have to be there too, but certainly the element for schools at least. And it was global. UNESCO estimated 1.3 billion learners were disrupted because of COVID and had to study at home and in schools, and in case in Hong Kong, in very small apartments as well. And it was extended. And one major thing too was, I would argue that the technology was here to support it already. We really was quite a unique time. If COVID had happened a few years ago, I'd say only a few years ago, the actual experiences and what teachers did may have been very, very different. So here are some of the big questions I've got. Did the disappearance of the physical construct, what we know to be a school and a classroom, create new ways to educate our students? And will they stay? Did COVID change the way schools educated students? How did school leaders and teachers respond initially? How well equipped were schools, or how well prepared were they for virtual learning? And how did they adapt to those new learning environments? And when I just did a little bit of reading around, I came across a really interesting paper by Yong Zhao. And it's worth going to his blog, by the way, if you're interested in what was going on with COVID, because he makes a comment about a paper published by two education historians, Tiak, if I've got that right, and William Tobin in 1994, who make this insightful observation that schooling as we know it follows a set rather like a language, and this is very apt, I think, for this conference as a metaphor, a set of grammatical rules and structures, just like natural language. So they talk about the grammar of schooling, okay? And it's just consciously understood by educators, it's consciously understood by students for sure, wherever they go, they will recognize a school and a classroom. And that it's so well embedded, we don't have to think about it. It's just always there. So that any departure from customary practice of schooling really gets a lot of attention. So I've sort of put on the slide there the references I've got, that's Zhao's paper and also TAW2022 paper, because I think it's very relevant. And this is what I'm interested in. Did COVID disrupt the grammar of schooling? Okay. And the grammar of schooling is what I would regard as those things like schedules, classrooms, tutor periods, year groups, dividing learning up into subjects, having reports, parents evening, all that stuff that we recognize to be things that go on in schools, you know, which is pretty universal, I would argue. Then, right, so let's look at what was the situation going on in school at the time. Well, first of all, as somebody has commented earlier, technology has never been the revolution that we thought it was going to be back in, say, the late 90s. It's been an evolution, not a revolution. And the first phase, which is often, I think, captured by people like Prensky and others who came up with the phrase digital native and so forth, it was a bit of a Wild West show, really. You know, it was very individualistic. It was highly disruptive. The ecosystem was dominated by what I would describe as digital gunslingers, you know, who were much admired and respected, and they did amazing things. But it was very, you know, it was full of surprises, shall I say. And then I would argue that then from about 2012, the whole digital landscape ecosystem of schools becomes kind of normalized. It around fairly connected technologies. And there's a better understanding of those technologies. I'm just going to jump to what I mean by that. For example, by 2020, this is the sort of digital landscape you're seeing in schools. Particularly technology that supports learning in the classroom, student response systems, Nearpod, Google Forms, Padlet, laptops and tablets, they're pretty universal. They may not be as readily available in some schools, but they are there. Use of digital cameras and video recording, very commonplace. Then there were technologies that supported learning beyond the classroom, platforms, Google Classroom, Seesaw, Flipgrid, all those sorts of things. Often these are free and open source as well for teachers, which they weren't in the early 2000s. Then there are all the cognitive tools that were popular with teachers, mind mapping tools, MindMeister, Poplet, Tinkercad, which is for design techniques, design and tech, Google Docs, Google Earth, you name it. And also, schools had quite sophisticated administration platforms by then. Here's a snapshot of one. And this is from an international school in Hong Kong, but you can see the sophisticated range of tools a teacher had available to them with which to know about their students, communicate with their students and with the parents. Platforms which meant the teacher didn't have to set up the Zoom conference, it was already done for them, they just simply have to follow the schedule and the like. And something I also mentioned earlier with the idea that a much better understanding of tech integration in schools with models like SAMR, for example, which some of you may be familiar, which help teachers understand that there were levels of engagement and adoption of technology in their classroom. They didn't all have to be digital gunslingers, as I've said before. You know, you could do quite ordinary stuff but still use technology well. There was a substitution level, augmentation, modification, and redefinition. So those are happening. And teachers were also regularly using technology to design learning resources in their classroom practice. So what was actually happening in classrooms at the time? Let's just do this one here. Now that varies a lot. If you look at the OECD sort of reports in 2019, you know, you'll see figures. Here we have school principals across the OECD reporting on shortages or inadequacies of digital technology was hindering learning quite a lot, a figure that ranged from 2% in Singapore to 30% in France, so quite variable. Mm-hmm. And so some principals may not even be fully aware of the affordances of some technologies that they were missing out on. But here's another figure that I thought interesting, that in 2018, only 53% of teachers on average let their students frequently or always use information technologies for projects and the like. So that's only about half by 2018. So though the technology is there, it's probably, and this is a very sweeping statement to say, I'll admit, often being used by the teacher themselves. And I think that's quite significant. So what happens when that asteroid hits, planet schools and COVID's arrived? Well, I often regarded teachers as the first responders. And I was kind of there on the ground, actually, with Jane, because we were doing a lot of school-based training in local schools in Hong Kong at the time. And we're meeting teachers who were heavily engaged in teaching online and using Zoom and the like. And my first observation was, and listening to what teachers told me was, they had to make it up from day one. I mean, though there was, a couple of weeks warning that this was going to happen and so forth, it was very much left to teachers on the ground as first responders to come up with solutions as to how to address some of the issues that Sal's covered as well. So what did I see teachers doing? Well, first of all, they upskill themselves incredibly rapidly. I'd never seen it. Well, I had seen it once before, but it really was quite surprising. And so did students. Remember, students are not the digital natives that Prensky often claim them to be. They're good with a mobile phone and they're good with gaming, but take them outside those areas and they've also got a lot to learn. So there's a lot of upskilling on both sides that happened, but it happened remarkably quickly and both were very comfortable within a matter of weeks in managing a Zoom environment. Teachers, for example, became very sophisticated at trying to find ways of engagement, what I call the pedagogy engagement. They use breakout rooms a lot, used them very effectively. But as Sal also indicated, they had to be very explicit about the rules of engagement in those breakout rooms. And I found that myself when I was doing my online ISTE training with practicing teachers, is that I too had to be very explicit as the online trainer about how I expected people to behave when they were in a breakout room or what they're actually doing when we were having a full session with the whole group together. Teachers also became, I noticed, very creative about use of third-party apps and embedding them into their use of Zoom. And I remember a couple of teachers telling us that actually they found Zoom made it easier to use these apps than it was if they were in their physical classrooms, because they're already in a digital environment. So adding something like Padlet or a mind mapping tool like Poblet was actually only just a few steps away. So I saw a lot of that going on, particularly the use of Google Forms or any other feedback system. So the teacher knew just what the students were picking up on and what they were learning. And I saw some really creative uses of that, in addition to things like emojis and so forth. Very widespread use of learning platforms. Indeed, so often the learning on Zoom had been prefaced with something the students had to do on the Google Learning platform or whatever else they're doing, sharing a Flipgrid video with the rest of their classmates and so forth. So there was a lot of sort of learning coming to the Zoom session that the students had been doing offline. And very creative ways of getting, I'm just going to move this so I can see it, of getting students to evidence their learning as well, getting that feedback. And that what's one of the legacies that I'll look at is from the COVID experience that teachers commented on. So question then I have is, why did this happen? Why that sudden turnaround in a matter of, in some cases, just a week or so, where teachers who maybe had not been using much technology or their students hadn't, were suddenly now becoming quite digitally sophisticated? Well, if you're a Hong Konger, you'll know that a COVID lockdown was not the first time. We had swine flu in 2009. In fact, I was teaching in a school in Hong Kong at the time and was also doing my master's at Hong Kong U and my dissertation. So this really fell into my lap and I became very interested in what happened, what was going on that enabled teachers to become so engaged with technology so quickly. And we came up with something with my colleague, David Kennedy, what we call the theory of activation. I want to just dwell on this for a minute, trying to sort of unpick just what happened when COVID hits. So some of you might have guessed, I'm a chemist by background, which is where the activation energy comes from, okay? Activation energy is that little bit of energy sometimes a reaction needs in order just to get started. Once it's started, it will often carry on by its own, if you like, momentum. It becomes exothermic. And we kind of use this sort of mindset to describe what was going on. So here we've got a graph to show the theory of activation energy conditions what we would call sustainable change. In other words, this is where a change happens and it just doesn't burn out after a few months or semesters. It sticks. It becomes a permanent feature of what goes on. But let's look what's going on. On the vertical side, you've got kind of the energy impediments, the things that stop teachers adopting the change because they've other things to do. And on the bottom line, you've got the period of time you're looking at, okay? And I want you to focus particularly on that green line, because to me, that green line represents the grammar of schooling, all the other things that always go on in a teacher's world and life that take up their time and their energy. And it kind of establishes a place somewhere along that graph. That's the place. Now, change comes along, and for teachers to make change, they have to put a lot of effort in. You can see that by that first graph that goes up quite a bit, doesn't it, with a big arrow, okay? Normally, they put a lot of energy in to make the change happen, in addition to what they always do. And remember, in schools, change is additive. Very few leaders in schools will say to teachers, look, we're going to do this new initiative, but we're also going to stop doing something else. It's always, we're going to do a new initiative on top of everything else, okay? But change, you know, when something like COVID happens, then the amount of energy required to make that change is represented by that smaller graph on the first part there, on here. And this is the energy and time to make the change. Now, here's our point. If, for example, teachers invest all that energy in adopting the technology and then find that the new ways of working are achieved more quickly and are having a beneficial effect on their students, then it sticks and it goes below that. The grammar of schooling, in fact, becomes part of their grammar of schooling, because the energy they're expending, okay, on it has set off a series of actions and learning behaviors which the teachers welcome. Now look at the converse of that. What happens when you get unsustainable change? You've got the same type of pattern on the graph. So you've got the grammar of schooling here, but this time the initial effort made to introduce the change, the adoption of the technology, does not pay off as far as the teachers is concerned. All right, the early adopters will continue to do it because that's part of what they do. But for the average teacher working in the classroom, new ways of working continue to require energy over and beyond the grammar of schooling, and therefore it burns out, it doesn't happen. And our argument was that the rapid change in teachers' approaches and attitudes to technology when COVID hit followed this pattern here. Now, the question we're going to have to look at is, now that we're going to go back into classrooms, okay, will their comfort with technology, with their use of technology, continue in the same way that it was being used during their time with COVID? So, what will be the legacy? I have a notion, though, that if I look at activation theory and my understanding of the grammar of schooling, that once schools go back to normal face-to-face, which largely is happening in Hong Kong and around the world, it certainly is where I am in Australia here at the moment, that the grammar of schooling will prevail, and that largely teaching and learning behaviors will return to what was the old normal. I can't, you know, it'd be interesting to see. Of course, there will be exceptions, there always are, and we'll happily read the schools and leaders who have decided to make COVID to be, if you like, the excuse for making very permanent changes. But there's another thing I think that's also happened, is that teachers have acquired, during this extended period of online learning, a digital proficiency which will be with them for the rest of their lives, okay? And which may see more developments, particularly in blended learning approaches, as more teachers have seen that they can sort of match synchronous with asynchronous learning very well using learning platforms like Google Classroom or Seesaw or Flipgrid or things like that, okay? And particularly in the use of classroom response systems. That I've heard many times anecdotally from my colleagues, is they've seen how useful learning response systems like Nearpod were, or Socrates were on their Zoom environment, and they've also seen that they could easily use those within their classroom environment, particularly where students do have access to some kind of digital device in their classroom. And that, of course, supports, as Sal says, very strongly their pedagogy of engagement, because it's giving teachers real-time feedback about where the learning is, where the learners are with regard to the task in hand. I think a third point too is that teachers will now be far less anxious about relocating to online learning. There always was a level of anxiety before, even distrust. Teachers have actually seen that their technology worked pretty well most of the time. Interestingly, from the students' perspective, I often used to hear reports of students claiming that when they were learning online, their wireless didn't work at home. Very strange that. Seemed to just have a problem when it was during the lesson time. Students are quite inventive and creative at times, aren't they? But teachers are certainly less anxious about relocating to online learning. In fact, I have heard reports that now in Hong Kong, should there ever be, and I'm sure there will be, a T8 or a Black Rain Day, that gone are the days when you could stay at home and enjoy the day at your leisure. Actually, the school will be expecting you to continue the lessons online. Whether you see that as good news or bad news remains to be seen. But I have two personal predictions, if you like, about the impact of COVID on schools. The first one is that I think a lasting change will be that teachers' learning may prove to be more transformational in the long term. What I think I've seen teachers, and we did this in certainly our own experience when we were doing our school-based training in Hong Kong during COVID, and much of that had to be relocated to a Zoom environment. Teachers have seen that they can do a lot of professional learning online. No longer is it the case that if you're a teacher, your access to professional training, professional network learning, call it what you will, is no longer limited to what the school provides or by what your regional district provides. You can access a lot of professional learning independently by yourself. And I think that is going to have a long-lasting effect on how teachers learn on that one. And I think, that to me is going to have, I suspect, a big impact on teachers' professional behaviors and how they see things. Their horizons will not be limited by the school. But I also have one last prediction, which I haven't put on this slide, which really comes to what Jane said. Jane talked a lot about the virtual assistant. And I personally become fascinated by what is called natural language processing technologies. And I've seen already the green shoots of where some schools are beginning to teach students how to develop their own virtual chatbot, how to design how to design conversations online. And I think that is something that become part of the digital learning environment that students experience in their schools, learning to create their own virtual chatbots, understand how to design conversations online. And that I'm sure will have an interesting impact in the business sector later on when those young people graduate and go out into the working world. So that brings my talk to a close. Thank you very much for your time, and I'll look forward to hearing questions later.